Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation History Story. Tonight we stand ankle deep in snow that squeaks instead of crunches, the kind of sound that tells you the cold has already won. The air feels sharp, clean, and oddly heavy in your lungs, like breathing through thin glass. Somewhere ahead, a small wooden cabin waits barely visible through a haze of frost. You probably won't survive this, at least not comfortably, and that's the honest part. No postcard ever mentions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and let yourself step forward with me. You're arriving at the very beginning of winter, not the gentle kind with pretty snowflakes, but the deep settled cold that drops to minus 40 degrees Celsius and stays there like it has a lease. Your eyelashes stiffen almost immediately. Your nose aches in a slow, dull way that feels more like pressure than pain. This is not dramatic cold, this is administrative cold. It fills out paperwork on your body and approves itself. Most historians agree that early settlers across northern North America and parts of northern Europe regularly endured temperatures below minus 30 degrees Celsius during the heart of winter. Minus 40 was not rare, just memorable. What's often debated is how ordinary people actually experienced it, because journals tend to understate misery. Writing "very cold today" was easier than admitting fear. You step toward the cabin boots heavy with packed snow. The structure looks simple, even humble. Squared logs stacked horizontally. A low door you will have to duck through. No porch, no decoration. The smell of pine resin still lingers faintly in the wood, mixing with smoke that leaks lazily from a short chimney pipe. That smoke matters more than you realize yet. You push inside and the sound changes instantly. Outside, the cold swallowed noise. Inside, the cabin breathes. The fire pops softly. Wood ticks as it contracts. The air smells of ash-damp wool and yesterday's food. This is home now, not cozy, not cruel, just necessary. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that most early settler cabins were built quickly, sometimes in less than a week, because exposure killed faster than hunger. Speed mattered more than craftsmanship. Straight walls were optional, gaps were inevitable. Perfection was a luxury for warmer decades. You take off your outer mittens but leave everything else on. You will learn soon that undressing is an act of confidence few people here possess. The cold has already taught you humility. Your fingers throb as warmth returns unevenly, pins and needles blooming slowly. There is a bed in the corner, if you can call it that. A raised wooden frame filled with straw and covered by rough blankets. It smells faintly sweet and faintly sour at the same time. Straw absorbs everything: sweat, smoke, time. One quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks is that settlers sometimes preferred sleeping on straw sacks over animal pelts, even though pelts were warmer because pelts could freeze stiff overnight from moisture. Straw stayed pliable, which mattered more at 3 a.m. You move closer to the fire. It is small controlled, not the roaring blaze you might imagine. Big fires eat wood too fast. That lesson arrives early and never leaves. The stove is iron darkened by soot with a faint red glow at its seams. You hold your hands out, palms open, careful not to get too close. Burns heal slower in winter. Everything heals slower. The cabin creaks softly, not from wind yet, but from temperature. Logs shrink as the cold deepens, opening gaps that will whistle later. You run your fingers along the wall and feel uneven surfaces, places where mud and moss were pressed in hastily. This chinking is imperfect by design. It cracks. It falls out. You will replace it more than once. Historians still argue whether settlers understood heat loss in any scientific sense, or whether they simply learned through trial, error, and suffering. Some suggest intuitive knowledge guided cabin placement and size. Others believe people survived mostly by a stubborn repetition doing what worked last winter and hoping it would work again. You sit on a low stool. The floor beneath your boots is packed earth, not wood. Dirt floors stayed warmer and avoided drafts. They also absorbed spill smells and whatever fell. You scrape ice from your boots with a knife and add it to a small pile near the door. That ice will melt slightly by morning, then refreeze. The cabin has its own weather. Outside, the wind begins to rise. You hear it before you feel it. A low, distant sound like breath moving through a tunnel. Soon it will test every weakness in the walls. You already know where the worst spots are, even without being told. Cold announces itself clearly. Your breath fogs the air, then drifts upward and disappears. You watch it slower than outside, thicker. Inside air holds on to things, smoke, heat, people. That is both blessing and problem. A more obscure historical note is that some settlers believed extreme cold carried disease away, that frozen air was cleaner and safer. In reality, cold reduced bacteria but increased respiratory strain. The belief persisted anyway because it offered comfort, and comfort was scarce. You rub your hands together, listening to the soft rasp of wool against skin. Your shoulders relax a fraction, not because you are warm, but because you are enclosed. Walls matter psychologically, even thin ones. The light fades early. By late afternoon, shadows stretch and blur. The flame becomes the center of the room. Your world shrinks to a circle of orange glow and dark corners beyond. You notice how quiet your thoughts become when there is nothing to look at but fire. This is not boredom yet. It is recalibration. Scholars still debate whether early settlers experienced long winters as mentally numbing or mentally sharpening. Some diaries describe despair, others describe focus. The truth likely shifts day to day, even hour to hour, depending on weather, health and sleep. You add a small piece of wood to the stove, not too big. You listen for the change in sound as it catches. A soft sigh, then a crackle. Fire has moods. You learn them the way you learn a person's breathing. As night settles fully, the temperature drops further. You feel it not as sudden pain, but as a steady tightening. Muscles draw inward. Joints complain quietly. You adjust your position, pulling your coat closer. This is the first night of many. You are not thinking about spring. You are thinking about staying awake just long enough to bank the fire properly, to arrange the blankets, to make sure tomorrow is possible. The cabin stands, the fire holds. You breathe slowly, deliberately, letting the cold sit where it wants. This is how it is. Morning does not arrive gently. You wake because the cold shifts, not because light appears. Your eyes open to dim grey leaking through the small window, the glass rimmed with lace-like frost patterns that grew overnight from your own breath. The fire has shrunk to a dull core of embers. The cabin feels tighter, as if the walls leaned inward while you slept. You sit up slowly, every movement deliberate. Rushing wastes heat. Your boots are stiff where yesterday's moisture froze them solid. You tuck your feet inside your coat first, borrowing warmth the way people borrow money here, carefully, and with the intention to repay it later. This is the season when cabins are either already standing or never will be. A mainstream historical fact often glossed over is that settlers who failed to complete shelter before deep winter rarely survived to finish it later. Frozen ground turned digging impossible. Snow erased work in hours. Timber cracked under extreme cold. Timing decided fate. You remember the frantic weeks before winter set in, when the cabin was raised not as a dream home, but as an emergency measure. Logs were cut green heavy with moisture. Axes rang sharp in the clear autumn air. Trees fell where they stood and were dragged only as far as strength allowed. Precision yielded to speed. The cabin you now inhabit was assembled with urgency baked into every corner. The logs are not uniform. Some bow slightly, others twist. The corners interlock imperfectly notched, just enough to hold. Aesthetic balance did not matter. Standing upright did. You stand and stretch joints, protesting quietly. The smell of cold ash rises as you stir the fire. You kneel, feeding it small dry pieces saved carefully for mornings like this. Soon the iron begins to tick as it warms. The sound feels reassuring, like a pulse returning. One quirky tidbit from settler accounts is that people often measured time by how many fires a cabin had hosted. A newly built cabin smelled sharp and green. After a few months, smoke softened the wood. After years, the walls themselves seemed seasoned, darker and more cooperative with heat. You step outside briefly because some tasks demand it. The door groans as it opens, the hinges stiff with frost. Cold slams into you instantly, more aggressive now than yesterday. Your breath vanishes sideways in the wind. Snow creaks underfoot like dry leather. The cabin stands alone against the white, small and defiant. You circle it, checking for obvious damage. Snow has drifted against the north wall, forming a shallow bank that actually helps insulate. This is one of those accidental advantages settlers learn to appreciate. Clearing snow completely made cabins colder, not safer. Historians still argue whether early settlers understood insulation principles intuitively or simply noticed patterns. Over time, some suggest experience taught them to let snow pile strategically. Others argue desperation forced acceptance of whatever happened naturally. You brush snow away from the door frame and check the roof line. The roof is low-pitched, covered in wooden shingles weighted with poles. Too steep and snow slides off, exposing thin layers beneath. Too flat and weight builds dangerously. The compromise roof is common here, shaped by fear as much as knowledge. Inside again, you stomp your boots gently to knock off ice, then set them near, but not too near the fire. Too close, and the leather cracks. Too far, and they remain rigid all day. There is always a narrow middle path. You eat breakfast standing. A chunk of bread hard enough to knock on. A slice of preserved meat shaved thin with a knife. It is cold but edible. Chewing warms it eventually. Hot food is a luxury for later. A lesser-known historical note is that many settlers skipped breakfast entirely during the coldest months, saving fuel and time. Morning was for restoring circulation and tending fires. Full meals waited until afternoon when warmth peaked slightly. You glance around the cabin, seeing it now not as refuge, but as work still unfinished. The walls need more chinking. Drafts whisper at ankle height. The window frame leaks cold like a slow sigh. Today's goal forms quietly in your mind. Seal one more gap. Improve one weak place. Scholars still debate whether early cabins were intentionally temporary or simply became permanent by accident. Some believe settlers always planned to build better homes later. Others argue survival consumed resources so completely that temporary became lifelong. You gather tools, a small shovel, a wooden mallet, a bundle of dried moss collected before snowfall. The moss smells faintly of earth, even now, a reminder of seasons you are not currently allowed to enjoy. Pressing, chinking into gaps is slow work. Your fingers numb quickly. You alternate hands, warming one while the other works. Mud freezes too fast to use easily now, so moss and wood chips become the filler of choice. This is imperfect. It helps anyway. As you work, the cabin responds. Drafts soften. The fire seems to hold its heat a little longer. These gains are subtle, but they matter. Settler survival often depended on improvements too small to celebrate. One strange fringe practice some settlers tried involved hanging animal skins over interior walls to block drafts. While it helped briefly, moisture buildup caused mold and stiffness. Many abandoned the method after one winter. You pause listening. Wind pushes against the walls, testing them. The cabin answers with creaks and low groans. It is not failing, it is speaking. By midday light strengthens slightly. Shadows sharpen. You allow yourself a moment near the window watching snow glitter, painfully bright. The world outside feels distant, almost fictional. Inside, everything is immediate. You sit again, conserving energy. Movement creates heat, but exhaustion steals it back. Learning when to stop is as important as learning when to act. Historians still argue whether the hardest part of winter survival was physical endurance or decision-making under constant stress. Many journals suggest mistakes born of fatigue killed more often than cold itself. You add another log to the fire and watch the flame curl around it slowly. The cabin holds, the cold waits, and you begin to understand that living here is not about defeating winter. but negotiating with it one small agreement at a time. By the third morning, you stop expecting silence. The cabin has a voice now. It clicks when the fire warms the iron. It sighs when the wind finds a gap. It complains softly as the logs shrink and settle further into themselves. You wake already listening, cataloguing sounds before opening your eyes. Cold seeps in from the floor first. Even through layers of wool and straw, it rises patiently like water filling a low place. You swing your legs off the bed and stand slowly, letting weight settle before balance. Sudden movements steal warmth you cannot afford. This is when you truly notice the walls. In daylight, the cabin looks solid enough, thick logs stacked tight, corners locked. But living inside reveals the truth. Between many logs, hairline gaps glow faintly with pale blue light. Wind slips through them like a whisper looking for ears. A well-established historical fact is that most early wooden cabins were never airtight, even by the standards of their own time. Tools were crude lumber, uneven, and precision expensive in both time and energy. Builders accepted drafts as inevitable and focused instead on managing them. You press your palm against one seam and feel the cold bite instantly. Not sharp pain, just a steady drain. You pull your hand back and flex your fingers until sensation returns. The problem is not one gap, it is hundreds of them. Each log shrinks slightly in extreme cold, green wood shrinks more. What looked tight in autumn opens by January. The cabin breathes whether you want it to or not. You gather your supplies again, in moss, dirt scraped from beneath the snow. Wood chips shaved thin, even dried grass finds its way into your hands. Nothing goes to waste here, especially not insulation. A quirky detail settlers sometimes mentioned with grim humour was that they could tell how cold the night had been by which gaps whistled loudest in the morning. Some seams sang, others merely sighed. You kneel by the wall and begin pressing material into a crack at knee height. The work is slow and awkward, gloves make it clumsy, bare hands make it painful. You alternate choosing efficiency over comfort, then comfort over numbness. Each filled gap changes the soundscape slightly. The wind dulls, the fire's crackle grows more present. These are not dramatic victories, they are cumulative. Historians still argue whether early settlers understood convection and heat loss in any formal way. Some scholars suggest folk knowledge passed quietly through generations guided cabin orientation and sealing techniques. Others argue people simply reacted to cold where they felt it most, learning by sensation rather than theory. You pause to warm your hands near the stove. The iron radiates unevenly, one side warmer than the other. You rotate like food on a spit, opposing each part of yourself to heat in turn. The smell inside the cabin has changed since your arrival. Smoke lingers longer now, caught by fewer drafts. Damp wool dries more slowly. The air grows heavier. This is another trade settlers accepted. Less wind meant less fresh air. Too much sealing caused headaches, coughing, and worse. A lesser-known historical observation is that some cabins were intentionally left drafty near the roofline to reduce smoke buildup. Settlers balanced warmth against breathing often unconsciously. You return to work higher on the wall, standing on a crate to reach shoulder-level gaps. Here the wind is stronger. It finds your neck, your ears. You pull your scarf tighter, feeling wool scratch pleasantly against skin. Outside the day remains brutally clear. Sunlight reflects off snow so brightly it hurts to glance at it. The world feels frozen in time, no birds, no insects. Just the occasional distant crack of a tree splitting from cold stress. That sound travels far in winter air, a sharp report like a gunshot. You freeze every time you hear it, heart jumping before reason catches up. You think briefly about how many settlers described winter forests as unsettling rather than beautiful. Trees did not sway gently, they snapped. The land did not sleep, it endured. Back inside, you finish sealing one wall section and step back. It looks no different. The logs remain crooked, the filler uneven, but you feel the difference immediately. The fire's heat lingers longer in the room. Your breath fogs less aggressively. These are the moments that build survival. Small quiet improvements no one records, A fringe method some settlers experimented with involved stuffing gaps with fabric scraps or old clothing. While effective, briefly mice and insects chewed through them quickly. Many abandoned the idea after discovering nests where insulation used to be. You eat a small meal near midday, a bowl of thin broth warmed just enough to steam. Holding it warms your hands more than drinking warms your stomach. You sip slowly, savouring heat rather than flavour. Your thoughts drift as you eat. Cold has a way of narrowing focus. You no longer think in weeks, you think in tasks. Seal this gap, add that log, eat now, rest later. Scholars still debate whether this narrowing of attention was psychologically protective or psychologically dangerous. Some argue it reduced anxiety by limiting mental load. Others suggest it increased vulnerability to depression over long winters. You stand and stretch again, joints stiffening faster than yesterday. Cold teaches you your body's weak points quickly, knees complain, wrists ache. You roll your shoulders, listening to quiet pops beneath layers. The afternoon passes with more chinking. You work until your fingers lose precision, until you drop tools without noticing. That is the signal to stop. Pride costs fingers here. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire and observe the cabin like a living thing. It feels calmer, less anxious. Or maybe that is you. Wind rises again after sunset. It tests the walls. Fewer whistles answer now. More thuds. The cabin holds its ground. You bank the fire, carefully arranging logs to burn slowly through the night. Not too tightly. Air matters. Everything is balance. As you lie down, fully clothed once more, you feel a subtle difference. The cold still presses in, but it feels slightly farther away. Not defeated, just delayed. You close your eyes, listening to the muted wind and the steady breath of the stove. The walls, imperfect as they are, stand between you and the open night. For now, that is enough. The cold settles deeper overnight, not louder or sharper, just heavier. You feel it before opening your eyes, a weight pressing gently but persistently against your chest and limbs. The fire has held barely. The cabin is dim, wrapped in a blue-grey half-light that makes everything feel paused. You rise carefully, shoulders as hunched by the habit now. The floor answers your feet with a dull chill that seeps upward through leather and wool. Somewhere along the wall, the wind is speaking again, softer than before, more selective. It has fewer places to enter, but it is patient. This is the work that never truly ends. You pull on your mittens and move toward the wall where yesterday's effort slowed the drafts but did not silence them. The chinking you pressed in has tightened as it froze, leaving narrow channels where cold still sneaks through. The materials contract and shift. Nothing stays finished for long in this climate. Settler journals from the early 19th century frequently describe repeated wall maintenance throughout winter, sometimes every few days after major temperature drops. Cabins were not static shelters, but structures in constant negotiation with their environment. You kneel and scrape loose old filler from a stubborn seam. It flakes away like dry bread. You replace it with a denser mix today, combining moss with frozen dirt softened briefly near the stove. Your hands ache as you work a slow burn rather than sharp pain. You welcome the sensation. It means blood is still moving. One unexpected habit noted in some personal letters involved settlers using animal hair mixed into chinking material. Hair added binding strength when mud froze and cracked. It was messy, unpleasant, and surprisingly effective. As you press the mixture into the gap, you think about how much effort goes into stopping something invisible. Wind has no shape, no colour, yet it dictates your entire routine. You feel it more than you see it. On your ankles, along your spine, at the back of your neck. You stand to check your work and feel the room respond. The fire's warmth no longer rushes upward immediately. It lingers at knee height. That matters. Heat that stays low keeps feet alive. There is ongoing disagreement among researchers about whether early settlers deliberately engineered cabins to trap heat near the floor, or whether this effect emerged accidentally due to low ceilings and dirt floors. Some argue intentional design played a role. Others believe necessity produced the same result without conscious planning. You turn your attention to the door. It is the weakest point always. Wood warps, hinges stiffen, gaps widen. You stuff a rolled piece of cloth along the threshold, wedging it tight with a stick. It looks crude. It works. A strange but practical workaround mentioned in a few Frontier accounts involved piling spare clothing directly against door seams at night, then redistributing garments each morning. Clothing became temporary architecture after sunset. By mid-morning, the cabin smells faintly of damp earth and smoke. You crack the door open briefly, letting in a slice of bitter air to refresh the room. The cold rushes in eagerly aggressive and immediate. You close the door again within seconds, heart racing slightly. Fresh air costs heat. Stale air costs comfort. Every choice carries weight. You eat a small portion of food while standing near the stove, chewing slowly. The sound of chewing feels loud in the quiet cabin. Outside, the wind has picked up driving fine snow sideways across the landscape. You watch through the small window as the world blurs. Some observers have pointed out that extreme cold changes how people perceive distance and time. Settlers often describe nearby trees as feeling impossibly far away in winter, as if the cold stretched space itself. You return to work along the wall opposite the fire, focusing on areas you feel most often. Knees, calves, the places that touch cold first when you sit. You begin to understand your own habits through these drafts, where you linger, where you rest. There is no full consensus among historians about whether early settlers prioritized sealing specific wall sections based on prevailing winds or simply responded to discomfort as it appeared. Wind patterns mattered, but sensation mattered more. Your fingers stiffen again, you pause, flexing them gently, holding them close to the stove until feeling creeps back. The iron hums softly, now radiating steady warmth. You lean your forehead briefly against its side, careful, listening to the faint vibration inside. The cabin feels smaller today, not claustrophobic, just contained. Your world has narrowed to its dimensions willingly. You know every sound it makes now, every smell. Even the way light shifts across the walls as the sun moves unseen behind clouds. By afternoon, fatigue settles in like another layer of clothing. Heavy, familiar. You sit on the stool and close your eyes for a moment, listening. Wind, fire, wood, breath. Nothing else intrudes. Academic discussion continues over whether settlers experienced long winters as periods of emotional numbness or heightened awareness. Some writings suggest senses sharpened as external stimuli disappeared. Others imply monotony dulled perception. Both may be true at different moments. You stand again and make one last pass along the walls, pressing loose bits back into place. You do not aim for perfection. You aim for improvement. That is enough. As evening approaches, the temperature drops again. You feel it not as shock, but as expectation. The cabin responds with deeper creaks. The doorframe groans faintly. You add fuel to the fire, early preparing for the night rather than reacting to it. You arrange your bedding carefully. Straw fluffed, blankets layered, coat folded to block a known draft near your shoulder. These small adjustments have become instinctive. Outside, the storm strengthens. Snow strikes the walls with a soft, persistent hiss. Inside, the light dims to amber and shadow. You sit back, breathing slowly, feeling the warmth hold just a little longer than yesterday. The gaps are still there. Winter still presses close. But the cabin resists now, not passively, but with quiet effort shaped by your hands. You lie down fully dressed, listening to the muted world beyond the walls. The wind tests again, finds fewer answers, and moves on. The fire settles, the night stretches ahead. You let your eyes close, knowing tomorrow will bring more of the same work, and strangely that knowledge comforts you. You wake in the dark to a sound that is not quite silence and not quite alarm. It is the stove settling. A soft metallic tick followed by a low murmur from the embers. You do not open your eyes yet. You listen first. The fire tells you how the night has gone. When you finally sit up, the room is cold but not hostile. That means the fire held. Barely. You swing your legs down and shuffle closer, palms out, letting warmth return in slow waves. Fire is not comfort here. It is conversation. Ignore it and it sulks. Overfeed it and it eats everything you have. Settler accounts from northern homesteads make it clear that wood stoves and hearths ran nearly non-stop through winter, sometimes for months without going fully cold. Letting a fire die overnight was risky. Restarting one in extreme cold wasted fuel time and feeling in your fingers. You kneel and adjust the coals with a poker gentle, as if touching an animal that might bite. A small log goes in placed just right. Too much air and it flares, too little and it smothers. You have learned this by watching, not by instruction. One odd detail that appears in several winter diaries is how often people named their stoves. Old Reliable, Black Mary, the Iron Friend. Giving the fire a personality made tending it feel less like labour and more like cooperation. The stove warms unevenly and you know its moods now. The left side radiates faster. The top plate holds heat longest. The pipe hums faintly when the draw is good. You rest a kettle near the edge, not to boil, just to remind the water that liquid still exists. There is no single agreement among historians about how much settlers understood combustion or airflow, in a technical sense. Some evidence suggests practical mastery without formal theory. Others argue most people relied on repetition and intuition rather than understanding why certain arrangements worked. You dress fully layer by layer, even though you never truly undressed. Wool shirt, another wool shirt, coat, scarf, mittens that smell faintly of smoke no matter how often they air out. Clothing here is an extension of the fire-portable warmth you carry with you. You add another piece of wood and listen. The sound changes, a deeper crackle, a steadier burn. Satisfaction settles quietly in your chest. This will last an hour, maybe two. After that, it will ask again. Fuel is never just fuel, it is time. Each log represents minutes of safety. You stack the next few pieces within arm's reach, arranging them by size. Small for quick heat, medium for balance, large for long burns while you sleep. It's widely accepted among historians that early settlers spent an extraordinary amount of time gathering firewood during warmer months, sometimes devoting entire seasons to cutting and storing enough fuel to survive winter. Wood piles were as important as food stores. You step outside briefly to fetch more breath, instantly burning your throat. The cold snaps at your face. Snow crunches loudly underfoot. The woodpile stands like a wall log's frosted white ends split and dry. You knock two together to shake off ice. The sound rings sharply in the still air. A lesser-known practice involves storing some firewood inside the cabin itself, stacked near the stove. While this warmed the wood and improved burning, it also invited insects and mice. Many settlers accepted the trade. Back inside, you feed the stove again and settle into the rhythm of the day. Tend fire. Warm hands, work briefly, return. The stove becomes the centre of everything. Meals, drying clothes, light, thought. As this day wears on, you notice how the fire shapes your posture. You angle your body toward it unconsciously. You sit where warmth pools. Your back knows when it has drifted too far from the glow. Researchers remain divided on whether constant fire tending increased stress or provided psychological grounding. Some argue the obligation added anxiety. Others suggest the repetitive care offered structure and reassurance during long, dark months. By afternoon, the cabin feels almost gentle, not warm but manageable. The fire has earned your trust for the moment. You allow yourself to sit and stare into it, watching patterns form and collapse. Time loosens its grip. You think about how easily fire can turn dangerous. Sparks jump, chimneys clog, many cabins burned down in winter sometimes with people inside too numb to react quickly. Caution lives alongside dependence. A curious workaround mentioned in a handful of letters involved keeping a bucket of snow near the stove rather than water. Snow did not freeze solid overnight and could be melted quickly in emergencies. As light fades, you prepare the fire for night. This is the most important ritual of all. Logs arranged carefully, airflow adjusted, dampers set just right. Too much burn and the stove goes cold before dawn. Too little and smoke fills the room. You check the chimney pipe with your hand, feeling vibration and warmth. The draw is steady. You nod to yourself. Small victories matter. There is debate among scholars about whether night banking techniques varied significantly by region or remained broadly similar across cold climates. Differences existed, but the principles rarely changed. Slow burn, steady heat, constant attention. You lie down near the fire, close enough to feel it, but far enough to stay safe. The glow paints the ceiling with shifting shadows. Your breathing slows to match the rise and fall of heat. Outside, wind scrapes against the walls. Inside, the stove answers with a low, steady sound. It is not loud. It does not demand. It simply exists as long as you remember to care for it. You drift towards sleep, knowing you will wake at least once to tend it again. This is not interruption. It is partnership. Fire keeps you alive. You keep it alive. As your eyes close, the last thing you register is warmth on your palms, and the quiet certainty that for now the night is handled. The worry arrives before you're fully awake. Not sharp, not panicked, just present. You open your eyes and your first thought is not the cold or the fire, but wood. How much remains? How fast it is disappearing? The question hums quietly beneath everything else like a second heartbeat. You rise and check the stove. Embers still glow faint but cooperative. You feed them gently and wait for the response. When the flame curls back to life, you feel a small release in your chest. One more cycle secured. Fuel is never far from your mind now. Even while eating, even while resting. It presses in during the quiet moments, reminding you that warmth here is rented, not owned. Surviving records from frontier settlements repeatedly show that families often burn through more firewood than they expected even after conservative planning. Winter consumed fuel faster than calculations predicted, especially during prolonged cold snaps when fires could not be allowed to drop at all. You step outside with an axe balanced carefully over your shoulder. The air bites instantly, crisp and unforgiving. Snow squeals under your boots. Each breath feels loud in your ears. The woodpile stands smaller than yesterday. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. You choose a log and split it with measured force. Wood fractures cleanly in extreme cold, cracking with a sound like breaking glass. The split pieces steam faintly as they are exposed to air. Even dry wood reacts to temperature like a living thing. An odd detail mentioned in some homestead letters is how settlers learned to judge remaining winter by the height of the woodpile rather than the calendar. When the pile reached knee height, concern set in. When it reached ankle height, sleep became harder. You stack the split pieces carefully, orienting them to shed snow. Sloppy stacking traps moisture. Wet wood burns poorly and smokes more. Smoke steals oxygen and warmth at the same time. Everything connects. Back inside, you warm your hands slowly. The fire welcomes the new wood, brightening briefly before settling again. You add just enough to maintain, not enough to waste. Excess heat is a kind of theft from tomorrow. There is continued debate among historians about whether settlers underestimated fuel needs due to optimism or simple lack of precedent. Some scholars argue early arrivals misjudged winter length. Others suggest they understood but had no choice, limited by time, tools and labour. As the day unfolds, you ration movement. Every task has a cost. Splitting wood warms you, but exhaustion follows. Resting conserves energy but lets the cold creep closer. You learn to alternate, instinctively guided by sensation more than logic. You eat a midday meal of whatever requires the least fire. Cold bread, preserved meat, a cup of warm water, not hot. Heating water fully costs too much fuel for the return it offers. Lukewarm is the compromise. One lesser-known practice involved settlers melting snow for drinking water directly on stove edges, rather than boiling pots, reducing fuel use slightly. It was slow and inconvenient, but efficiency mattered more than comfort. The afternoon light feels thinner today. Clouds drift in, dulling the world outside. Snow begins to fall lightly, then steadily. Each flake adds weight to the landscape and insulation to the ground. You watch from the window, knowing both effects matter. Inside, you count logs without meaning to. That stack. This pile, the small reserve tucked under the bench, your mind tallies constantly, even when you try to stop it. Researchers disagree on whether fuel anxiety was the dominant psychological stressor of winter or merely one of many. Some accounts emphasize hunger and isolation more. Others return again and again to firewood, framing it as the true currency of survival. You decide to cut more wood despite the weather. Snowfall is easier to work in than deep cold without movement. You layer up and step back outside, axe in hand, shoulders braced against wind. The work is slower now. Snow clings to everything. Your gloves grow damp. You knock them together periodically, shaking off ice. The rhythm steadies you. Lift, swing, split, stack. Breath fogs and vanishes. Your thoughts narrow again. There is only the log in front of you and the fire it will become. Future warmth made tangible. By late afternoon, fatigue drapes itself over you heavily. You stop not because the job is finished, but because your body says enough. Pride has no place here. Injury costs more than any single log is worth. Back inside, you dry your gloves near the stove, rotating them carefully. Too close and they scorch. Too far and they stay wet. You know this dance now. This dance. A curious note from a handful of winter journals describes settlers sleeping with a small reserve of firewood near the bed, not for warmth but for reassurance. Knowing it was there eased the mind enough to sleep. As evening approaches, you bank the fire again more cautiously than usual. Wood feels precious tonight. You choose larger pieces arranged to burn slowly. You adjust the airflow with care, listening closely. There is no clear consensus among scholars about whether winter routines reduced long-term stress or accumulated it. Some survivors describe relief in spring. Others carried the tension forward, unable to shake the habit of counting and conserving. You sit quietly for a while, watching the fire settle. Snow taps softly against the window. The cabin feels smaller but steadier. You have added to the pile. You have extended tomorrow a little further. When you finally lie down, fully clothed as always, your mind keeps tallying for a few minutes longer. Logs left, nights ahead. Then gradually the numbers fade. The fire hums low and steady. Your breathing slows to match it. Wood waits by the stove. For now, that is enough to let sleep come. Night does not arrive with ceremony. It simply thickens. You notice it first in the way the firelight seems smaller, less ambitious, clinging close to the stove instead of reaching across the room. The cabin cools gradually, not enough to alarm you, but enough to remind you that warmth here is always conditional. You prepare for sleep the way others prepare for travel. Clothes stay on, all of them, shirt over shirt, trousers tucked into socks layered where circulation allows. You loosen nothing. Even your belt stays fastened. Coldest taught you that undressing is a gamble taken only in summer memories. This way of sleeping was common across cold frontier regions. Personal accounts from settlers make it clear that people rarely slept in nightclothes alone during deep winter. Clothing was bedding. Bedding was insulation. The distinction mattered very little once the temperature dropped far enough. You shake out your blankets, releasing faint smells of smoke and straw. They are heavy, uneven, patched in places. Each layer traps air, and air is what you're really collecting. You arrange them carefully, folding edges to block known drafts. One blanket goes crosswise at your feet. Another folds up near your shoulders. You have learned where heat escapes fastest. Before lying down, you stand near the fire for a full minute, turning slowly. Back, sides, front. You warm yourself evenly like a loaf before baking. Rushing this step leads to shivering later, which wastes energy and sleep. One small detail mentioned casually in several winter journals is that people often place their next day's clothing inside their bedding at night, not to change, but to keep garments flexible and warm for morning. Frozen clothes turn dressing into an ordeal. You lower yourself onto the bed frame carefully. The straw shifts beneath you with a dry whisper. It compresses quickly, forming a shallow nest shaped by weeks of use. The cold presses upward, but slower now. The layers resist. You pull the blankets up to your chin and tuck your scarf loosely around your neck. Your breath warms the fabric almost immediately. The air inside the blankets feels different from the rest of the cabin. Still, dense yours. There is ongoing discussion among historians about whether settlers slept more lightly in winter due to constant vigilance or whether exhaustion pushed them into deeper rest despite discomfort. Surviving accounts suggest both patterns existed, shifting with age, health and circumstance. The fire crackles softly, but you know it will not last all night. You expect to wake once, maybe twice, to feed it. This is not a failure of sleep, it is part of it. You drift knowing interruption is scheduled. Your boots sit near the stove toes angled toward a warmth. They will still be cold in the morning, but not hostile. You glance at them briefly before closing your eyes, mentally checking that detail off the list. Outside, the wind slides along the walls, probing. Inside, the cabin responds with low, familiar sounds. Nothing sharp, nothing new. That is reassuring. A curious habit noted in a handful of letters describes settlers sleeping with hats pulled down over their eyes, even indoors, to reduce heat loss from the head. The practice looked odd, but made measurable difference in comfort. You pull your own hat lower, now feeling the wool brush your eyelashes. Darkness deepens behind your closed lids. Your breathing slows as your body begins to accept rest. Your thoughts wander briefly. You think about warmth in abstract terms, about how it moves, how it leaves, how everything you did today was in service of keeping it nearby. The work feels endless, but also strangely complete. There is always something to do, and that means there is a next step. Researchers have not reached a shared view on whether such tightly structured winter routines protected mental health or quietly eroded it over time. Some settlers later described winter as clarifying. Others remembered only fatigue. You shift slightly, finding the position that keeps your shoulders shielded from a faint draft. The adjustment is automatic now. Your body remembers even if your mind drifts. Minutes pass, or longer. Time loosens. Eventually you wake briefly to the sound you were expecting. The fire has thinned to embers. The cabin feels sharper at the edges. You do not fully sit up. You reach out, feed the stove with practiced movements and lie back down before cold can settle too deeply. The flame answers, softly, obediently. You tuck the blankets back into place and settle again. This time sleep comes more fully. Your body has learned the pattern. Wake, warm, rest, repeat. Outside, the night stretches wide and indifferent. Inside, wrapped in wool and habit, you float just above the cold rather than fighting it. Your breathing steadies. The fire holds. The cabin listens. For now you sleep. You wake before the fire asks this time. Not from cold exactly, but from awareness. Your eyes open to darkness edged with faint grey, the kind that suggests morning is approaching, but not yet willing to admit it. Your breath feels thick inside the blankets, warm and slightly damp. You pause, listening. The cabin is quiet in a new way. You notice it immediately. No wind whistling through the walls, no sharp hiss at the seams. The sounds that used to creep in overnight have softened, as if muffled deliberately. When you finally sit up and look around, you see why. Frost has claimed the inside of the cabin. It coats the walls in pale feathers and branching patterns, delicate and strangely beautiful. Ice blooms outward from every remaining cold point, tracing the outline of logs, knots and seams. The window is nearly opaque now, sealed with a thick crystalline skin. Even the nails in the wall wear tiny white halos. This phenomenon was widely reported in extreme cold regions. When interior warmth met sub-zero air leaking through walls, moisture from the breath and cooking froze, instantly forming ice directly on interior surfaces. Cabins became winter landscapes of their own. You reach out and touch one patch lightly. The frost crunches under your finger, breaking into powder. Cold rushes in where it was sharp and immediate. You pull your hand back quickly and rub it against your coat. The fire has dropped low but not failed. Embers glow faintly, just enough to keep the room from turning hostile. You feed it carefully, watching flame climb and shadows begin to move again. As warmth spreads, the frost does not melt right away. It waits. One peculiar detail mentioned in several settler memoirs is that people learned to read frost patterns as diagnostic tools. Thick ice meant leaks. Uneven patterns revealed weak walls. The cabin told its own story in white. You stand slowly, joints stiff, and stretch as far as layers allow. Your movements feel heavier today. The cold has settled into your muscles overnight. You welcome the heat from the stove rotating in place until sensation returns evenly. As the room warms, the frost begins to change. It loosens its grip, not turning to water immediately, but softening, shedding tiny crystals that drift downward like dust. You hear it faintly, a soft patter against the floor and furniture. There remains disagreement among historians about how settlers managed moisture inside cabins during prolonged cold. Some argue people accepted dampness as unavoidable. Others suggest deliberate venting and frequent fires reduced buildup. Evidence supports both views in different regions. You glance at the bed. Frost has crept along the frame, clinging to exposed wood. The straw mattress feels colder than usual. You shake it out lightly, sending a fine cloud of ice particles into the air. They sparkle briefly in the firelight before settling. The smell in the cabin shifts as the frost recedes. Damp wool, smoke, a faint mineral scent from melting ice. You open the door a crack to let some air move through. Coal pours in eagerly, but so does clarity. You close it again, quickly satisfied. A small but telling habit appears in winter letters, where settlers describe scraping interior frost daily as routine maintenance, much like sweeping. Left alone, ice thickened and worsened drafts when it fell away unevenly. You take a wooden scraper and gently remove frost from the worst areas, especially near your sleeping space. The ice flakes off in sheets, sometimes revealing dark wood beneath. Each cleared patch warms faster, feels more cooperative. Your breath fogs the air as you work. You notice how sound behaves differently today. Softer, muted. Extreme cold absorbs noise and ice dampens it further. Even your movements feel quieter. Scholars continue to discuss whether this acoustic dulling contributed to the sense of isolation many settlers reported in winter. Silence pressed inward. Without birds, insects, or flowing water, people were left with only their own sounds. You prepare a simple meal once the stove is steady. Warmed bread, a cup of water brought just to steam. You sip slowly, savouring the heat travelling downward. Your fingers wrap around the cup longer than necessary, borrowing warmth wherever possible. The frost returns more slowly now, does not reclaim cleared areas immediately. That feels like progress even if you know it is temporary. Everything here is temporary, measured in hours and degrees. By midday, light pushes weakly through the window, refracted by remaining ice into soft halos. The world outside looks unreal, blurred and distant. Inside the cabin feels like a separate climate, fragile but functioning. You sit and rest for a while, watching the last frost crystals retreat as warmth wins small battles. Your breathing evens out. Your shoulders drop. There is no triumph in this, only maintenance. As afternoon fades, you prepare again for night. You bank the fire carefully, mindful that moisture will return once heat drops. You arrange your bedding with extra care, anticipating cold surfaces. When you lie down, you feel the cabin cooling already, the cycle restarting. Frost will come back, you accept this. The walls will wear white again by morning. You close your eyes, knowing now that winter lives inside as much as outside. It paints the walls, it shapes sand, it leaves its mark inches from your face. Still the fire holds, the cabin stands, and wrapped in layers and routine, you drift back towards sleep, surrounded by quiet ice and patient heat. You wake with the taste of cold in your mouth. Not unpleasant, just sharp like metal that has been left outside overnight. Your breath forms a dense cloud inside the blankets before drifting upward and thinning. You stay still for a moment, noticing how even breathing feels louder now, more deliberate. The cabin holds its breath with you. You sit up slowly and see it again. The faint haze hanging in the air. Condensation. Every exhale you released through the night has lingered, gathered, and returned to you. The walls glisten faintly where yesterday's frost melted and refroze unevenly. Nothing here ever truly disappears, it just changes form. You move closer to the stove and feed the embers. Flame rises weak at first, then steadier. The iron warms and begins its familiar ticking. With heat comes sound, and with sound comes reassurance. The room feels less suspended, more grounded. People living through extreme winters often describe breath as a visible presence indoors. In cabins where fires burned constantly and windows stayed shut, air filled with vapour quickly. This was not an anomaly, it was daily life. You exhale slowly and watch the cloud form again. It floats, drifts, then dissolves. You find yourself timing it without meaning to. How long it hangs, how far it travels. These small observations become entertainment in a world stripped of variety. A strange little habit appears in some personal writings where settlers described counting breaths to stay calm during long dark hours. Breath was free of warmth at the end of continuity. As the fire strengthens, the condensation loosens its grip. Droplets gather along seams and drip quietly to the floor. The sound is soft, irregular. You listen. Drip. Pause. Drip. It reminds you that the cabin is not sealed, not perfect, just functioning. There is no settled agreement among researchers on how much indoor moisture contributed to illness during winter. Some argue damp air worsened respiratory problems, others note that extreme dryness caused its own issues. Settlers had little control over either condition. You wipe moisture from the window with your sleeve, clearing a small circle. Outside, the world looks distant and flat, snow, stretching unbroken in every direction. Even familiar landmarks seem farther away in this light. Cold compresses perspective. You prepare water by setting a container near the stove, not to boil, just to soften. Steam rises slowly, barely visible at first, then more pronounced. The air grows thicker again, warmer but heavier. You adjust the damper slightly, seeking balance. One practical trick mentioned casually in a few winter accounts involved hanging damp cloth near the stove to manage air dryness and static shocks. It helped some, annoyed others, and was abandoned as often as it was tried. You eat standing, chewing slowly. Food tastes different in this air, less vivid. Texture matters more than flavour. Warmth matters more than fullness. As the morning passes, you notice how sound behaves. Your footsteps feel muted. Even the crack of a log settling in the fire seems softer. Snow outside absorbs noise completely. The world feels wrapped in layers, padded and distant. Some scholars suggest this muffling effect altered settlers' sense of time. Without sound cues, hours blurred together. Bell's animals, even windward, dulled. People relied on fire cycles and body sensation instead. You find yourself listening more closely to your own movements. The scrape of a chair, the rustle of fabric. Your breathing becomes a reference point. You adjust pace unconsciously, matching actions to breath. You step outside briefly to dump ice scraped from inside surfaces. The cold hits immediately, bracing and clean. Your breath vanishes faster here, stolen by open air. You inhale deeply once, then retreat inside, grateful for walls. Back indoors, the contrast feels dramatic. The air feels thick again, warm, alive. You close the door and listen to the latch settle. That sound carries weight. By midday, the condensation has mostly retreated, leaving damp patches that will freeze again later. You accept this as part of the cycle. Moisture arrives. Heat pushes it back. Cold returns to reclaim it. Discussion continues among historians about whether settlers actively tried to manage interior air quality or simply endured conditions as they arose. Evidence suggests most people adapted instinctively rather than strategically. You sit near the stove, hands extended, palms open. Heat rises and wraps your fingers slowly. You flex them gently, feeling stiffness release. Outside light shifts imperceptibly. Inside time is measured in sensations rather than hours. As evening approaches, you prepare for the return of frost and fog. You adjust bedding. Move objects away from walls where ice will form again. These small acts feel almost ceremonial now. When you lie down, the air cools gradually. Your breath becomes visible once more. Small clouds blooming and fading above your face. You watch them for a while, letting thoughts drift. The The cabin listens, the fire settles, the air thickens gently. Wrapped in layers and routine, you breathe slowly, aware of each exhale, each pause, each return. The cold waits, the warmth answers, and somewhere between the two, sleep finds you again. Morning arrives carrying weight, not light, not promise, just the sense that another cycle is completed and immediately begun again. You open your eyes to a cabin that feels steadier than it did days ago, not warmer exactly, but familiar. Familiarity counts for more than comfort here. You rise slowly and listen before moving. Fire first. The stove answers with a low, patient sound. It survived the night. You nod once, as if acknowledging a partner who kept watch while you slept. Food becomes the next concern, though it never fully leaves your thoughts. Hunger here is not dramatic. It is quiet and persistent like the cold. You do not feel starving. You feel aware. Settlers in extreme northern regions relied heavily on preserved foods during deep winter, often consuming diets dominated by dried meat, hard bread, and stored roots. Fresh food was rare, not because people forgot how to grow it, but because the land simply refused cooperation for months at a time. You reach for a chunk of bread and tap it lightly on the table. Solid, reliable. You shave off a portion of preserved meat and chew, slowly letting warmth from the stove do half the work. The food tastes muted, but it fills space. That is enough. One odd habit surfaces in winter letters, where people describe sucking on frozen berries saved from summer, letting them thaw in the mouth like candy. The sweetness arrived late, but it arrived all the same. You heat a small amount of water, just enough to send up steam. The air thickens again, breath and warmth mingling. You drink carefully. Hot liquids feel extravagant now. You do not linger on the sensation, you accept it and move on. There remains uncertainty among historians about how nutritionally balanced winter diets truly were for early settlers. Some argue preserved foods met basic needs surprisingly well. Others suggest deficiencies were common but poorly documented. The truth likely varied household to household. As the morning settles, you notice how cold affects appetite. Eating too much makes you sluggish. Eating too little leaves you hollow. You learn moderation by sensation rather than rule. Your body becomes the ledger. You clean up slowly, not because cleanliness matters much, but because routine does. Crumbs swept, knife wiped, small order imposed on a stubborn world. These acts anchor the day. Outside, the sky remains pale and distant. Snow reflects light upward, erasing shadows. Inside, the fire draws everything inward again. Your world contracts willingly. You sit near the stove and let your thoughts wander while chewing the last of your meal. Food here is fuel, not distraction. It supports the work of staying warm, staying alert, staying calm. A lesser-known note from frontier journals mentions how people sometimes delayed eating until mid-afternoon when fires burned strongest conserving fuel by combining cooking and heating. Hunger became flexible, shaped by heat rather than clock. You add a log to the stove and watch the flame curl around it. The sound changes. You recognize it instantly. A good burn, dry wood, no weight. The smell of food lingers, faintly mixing with smoke and wool. It settles into the cabin the way everything does, becoming part of the background. Nothing is temporary here except heat. Some researchers have questioned whether the monotony of winter diets contributed more to emotional strain than physical hunger. Letters suggest boredom with food weighed heavily even when bellies were technically full. You stand and stretch, feeling yesterday's labour in your shoulders. Muscles ache, dully, not painfully. The cold keeps soreness close to the surface. You move carefully, warming joints before asking anything of them. The day opens slowly. There is no rush. Rushing wastes energy. You choose one small task and commit to it. Adjusting a shelf, repositioning stored food away from frost-prone walls. Tiny improvements stack quietly. As the fire strengthens, you take advantage of the warmth to soften another piece of bread near the stove. It bends slightly now. Chewing becomes easier. You smile at the small mercy. A curious workaround noted in a handful of personal accounts involved placing food inside clothing layers to keep it from freezing solid while moving around the cabin. Warmth travelled where people did. You eat again smaller this time, not from hunger, but from habit. Winter teaches you to spread intake across the day, smoothing energy rather than spiking it. There is ongoing discussion among scholars about whether settlers experienced weight loss or gain over long winters. Some evidence points to gradual loss from exertion and limited variety. Other accounts describe surprising resilience. Bodies adapted in uneven ways. You clean your hands on a scrap of cloth and tuck it back into your pocket. Nothing is wasted. Even grease matters, even crumbs. As afternoon light shifts slightly, you feel the cabin relax around you. The fire hums. The walls creak less. Frost retreats. This is the warmest the day will be. You take advantage of it instinctively. You prepare food for later setting, pieces close to heat so they will be pliable when needed. Planning ahead saves fuel, saves effort, saves frustration. Outside wind lifts snow into brief spirals before settling again. Inside the air feels dense and cooperative. You sit and breathe, noticing fullness rather than hunger now. As evening approaches, appetite fades naturally. Cold dulls it, you're grateful. Less eating means less fuel used, less mess, less thought. You arrange food stores carefully before night, stacking them away from the coldest walls. You have learned where frost creeps first. Knowledge earned by trial stays longer than instructions. When you finally settle near the fire, you feel satisfied without feeling indulgent. Food has done its job. You have done yours. The cabin holds warmth. Your body holds energy. Tomorrow waits quietly. You lie down knowing that eating here is not pleasure or deprivation. It is balance practiced daily, shaped by cold and fire and the steady work of endurance. Sleep comes easier when hunger is quiet. You discover quickly that water is not a given here. It does not flow. It does not wait patiently in a container. It resists. Each morning begins with the same quiet question, not whether you are thirsty, but how much effort liquid will demand today. The container by the stove holds what was once snow. Overnight it stiffened again, a cloudy block pressing against metal. You tap it with your knuckle and feel the dull answer. Not ready yet. You slide it closer to the iron and wait. This waiting is part of the work. In many cold settled regions, households spent a surprising portion of each winter day simply converting ice into usable water. Wells froze. Streams hid under thick lids of snow and ice. Snow became the most reliable source, even though it came with its own problems. You scoop more from outside, packing it loosely so heat can reach between crystals. Packed snow melts slower. You learned that after the first frustrating attempts produced nothing but steam and disappointment. As the stove warms the container, faint trickles form along the edges. You hear them before you see them. The sound is small, almost shy. Water returning cautiously. One peculiar note buried in several winter letters describes settlers complaining that melted snow tasted flat empty or somehow wrong. Some added ash salt or even bits of wood charcoal to improve the flavour. Others simply accepted it as another compromise. You pour a little into a cup and sip slowly. It is barely warm. That is fine. Too hot wastes fuel. Too cold stiffens the throat. Everything here lives between extremes. There has never been full agreement among researchers about whether relying on snow for water caused widespread health issues. Some argue mineral deficiency played a role. Others suggest people compensated unknowingly through food and soil residue. The evidence remains scattered. You store what water you can in the warmest corner of the cabin away from drafts. Containers line up like quiet promises. You cover them loosely, not sealing them completely. Trapped moisture creates ice faster. Experience teaches you what books never could. Your hands feel raw from handling snow and metal. You rub them together near the stove, feeling pins and warmth return unevenly. Fire is patient, you are learning to be as well. Later you take a bucket and head outside toward a familiar drift where snow stays clean and windswept. You choose carefully. Snow near the cabin is contaminated with ash, dirt and debris. Even winter has hygiene rules. Some settlers developed preferred snow sources, returning to the same drifts all season, like wells that moved with the wind. Letters mention favourite spots with surprising affection. Back inside, you melt more slowly, methodically. Water is precious not because it is scarce, but because it costs so much to create. You wash only what is necessary. Hands, utensils, face briefly. There is still debate among scholars about how often settlers wash during deep winter. Some accounts suggest infrequent cleaning. Others imply regular but minimal routines. The truth likely balanced discomfort against practicality. You use leftover warm water to wipe down surfaces near the stove, removing condensation before it freezes again. Ice builds problems if ignored. Prevention saves work later. As afternoon approaches, the cabin grows warmer. This is your chance. You heat a larger batch of water enough to last into evening. Steam fogs the room, briefly thickening the air. You open the door for a breath of cold, then close it again quickly. One small trick mentioned in a handful of journals involved storing water containers upside down. Ice formed at the bottom, first leaving liquid near the opening. It was not perfect, but it helped. You rearrange containers based on warmth zones you now know instinctively. Near the stove, against the inner wall, never near the floor. Knowledge settles into your body as much as your mind. By late afternoon, fatigue returns, waterwork is deceptively draining, lifting, waiting, monitoring, none of it dramatic, all of it necessary. You sit near the fire and sip again. The water tastes faintly of smoke now, you barely notice. Taste adapts quickly when options narrow. Some historians suggest that mastering water management marked a turning point in winter survival. Once water routines or circles stabilized, everything else felt more manageable. The cabin became predictable. As evening draws near, you secure what water you have. Lids adjusted, containers placed, snow packed for tomorrow. Preparation eases the night. When you finally settle down, throat warm, hands clean enough, you feel a quiet satisfaction. You have turned winter into something cooperative again, at least for today. The fire hums, the water waits, and wrapped in routine and heat, you let your breathing slow, knowing tomorrow's work is already half done. Evening stretches longer than it used to, not because the sun sets earlier, but because darkness feels thicker, more deliberate. By late afternoon, the cabin has already decided it is night. Shadows gather in corners and refuse to leave. The small window turns from pale grey to deep blue, then to nothing at all. Light becomes something you manage carefully. You move closer to the stove and adjust the lamp. Its flame is small, steady and precious. Oil is limited. Wicks wear down. Too much light wastes resources. Too little strains your eyes and your nerves. You strike a balance and let the glow settle. In winter cabins, artificial light rarely extended far beyond the stove or table area. Settlers planned their evenings around what could be seen by firelight alone, often ending productive work hours earlier than the body expected. You sit where the light reaches and notice how it changes the room. The walls feel closer, the ceiling lowers. Everything outside the glow simply stops existing. This shrinking world is not frightening anymore. It is contained, predictable. You mend something by the light. A tear in a mitten, a loose seam in a sleeve. Your fingers move slowly, guided more by memory than sight. The thread resists, slightly stiff from cold. You warm it briefly between your fingers before continuing. One small habit mentioned casually in winter journals involves people rotating tasks based on light quality. Sewing and reading were saved for evenings. Heavy labour waited for daylight, even if daylight felt weak. The lamp flickers once and you pause, heart tightening briefly. You adjust the wick and wait. The flame steadies again. Losing light unexpectedly is unsettling in a way hunger is not. Darkness presses inward quickly when invited. There is no universal agreement among historians about whether long winter evenings increase storytelling and conversation or encourage silence. Some families described hours of talk. Others wrote of quiet rooms where only fire and breath made sound. You know, is how sound behaves in low light. The crackle of the stove feels louder. Fabric rustles sharply. Even your breathing seems amplified. Without visual cues, your ears take over. You stand and move carefully, keeping one hand near the wall to orient yourself. Furniture becomes familiar by touch, edges remembered, distances learned. You could cross the cabin blind now if needed. A curious note from the handful of accounts describes settlers placing reflective objects near lamps to stretch light further, polished metal, tin plates, even water in shallow dishes. The effect was subtle but appreciated. You try it yourself, angling a metal utensil near the flame. The light spreads slightly, softening the darkness. It is not dramatic. It is enough. You prepare for sleep earlier than your body expects. Winter reshapes circadian rhythm, whether you agree or not. Fighting it costs energy. Accepting it gives rest. As you bank the fire, the lamp remains lit. 2 points of light now define the room. Heat and sight. Both flicker. Both require attention. Scholars still differ on whether reduced light exposure during long winters contributed to mood changes among settlers or whether physical exhaustion mattered more. Diaries suggest both forces acted together, reinforcing one another. You extinguish the lamp deliberately, not rushing. Darkness arrives instantly, complete and heavy. The fire remains glowing softly. You let your eyes adjust, watching shapes reappear slowly. You lie down and pull blankets close. The firelight dances faintly on the ceiling, a slow hypnotic movement. Your breathing follows it without effort. Outside the world is gone. Inside light has done its job for the day. You close your eyes, knowing tomorrow will bring it back measured and managed again. For now, darkness wraps around you yet, and sleep comes without resistance. Morning brings a different kind of cold today. Not sharper, not deeper, just more demanding. You feel it immediately in your hands when you reach for the stove tools. Metal answers with a sting that makes you pause and flex your fingers before continuing. Some days the cold negotiates. Other days it dictates. You coax the fire awake and stand waiting, letting heat rebuild circulation slowly. Rushing this part never ends well. Fingers need patience. So do wrists. You have learned that pain arrives later when ignored early. As the room warms unevenly, you begin to notice the tools themselves. Axe head, knife blade, hammer. Each rests where you left it, but none feel quite the same in this temperature. Wood handles feel brittle. Iron feels unforgiving. Tools are no longer neutral helpers. They demand attention. People living through prolonged sub-zero winters often reported tools failing without warning. Iron snapped more easily. Wooden handles split along hidden grain lines. Even well-made equipment had limits once cold pushed past them. You pick up the axe and test the balance carefully before stepping outside. The handle creaks faintly, not from strain, but from temperature shift. You listen for that sound now. It tells you more than sight ever could. Outside, the cold is absolute. It wraps around you, instantly flattening breath against your face. Snow feels sharper underfoot, each step ringing louder than it should. You position yourself carefully and bring the axe down on a waiting log. The impact feels wrong, too clean, too sudden. The wood fractures abruptly, sending a vibration up your arms that makes you drop the axe and shake your hands. Cold travels through metal faster than thought. One small but telling habit noted in winter letters describes settlers warming tool handles near the fire before using them, even if only briefly. A few seconds of warmth reduced splitting and saved skin. You retrieve the axe and continue more cautiously, adjusting grip and force. Work slows. That is acceptable. Injury costs far more than time. Inside again, you inspect a knife whose blade shows a fine crack near the base. You do not remember dropping it. It simply gave up. You set it aside gently. It will not be trusted again. The historical record suggests that winter tool loss was common enough to shape daily routines. Tasks were modified. Technique softened. People adapted work to what tools survived rather than forcing tools to meet expectations. You mend what you can. A loose handle tightened. A splinter sanded smooth. Repairs are not permanent solutions, just extensions of usefulness. Everything here is provisional. A passing remark in one homestead journal mentions using bone tools during the coldest weeks because metal became too dangerous to handle bare-handed. It reads oddly modern, like improvisation born of necessity. You turn to indoor tasks that require less force. sharpening blades gently, sorting supplies, adjusting shelves that shifted as logs contracted. The cabin changes shape subtly as winter deepens. You respond in kind. There is still uncertainty among researchers about how much technological adaptation occurred within individual winters versus between seasons. Some evidence suggests people learned quickly and adjusted on the fly. Other accounts imply lessons came too late for many. You notice stiffness creeping into your shoulders and stop before it hardens into pain. Rest here is active, warming hands, rolling joints, letting heat settle where cold tried to stay. The fire crackles staidly. You sit nearby and observe the tools lined up against the wall. They look heavier than they did weeks ago, or maybe you are simply more aware of what they ask of you now. Cold sharpened judgment, it does not forgive mistakes. By midday you attempt a small repair on the door latch. Metal protests immediately. You switch to a wooden wedge instead, shaping it carefully with slow movements. The wedge fits imperfectly, but it holds. Function over form wins again. Some accounts hint that settlers gradually shifted from iron-heavy solutions to wood-based ones during deep winter. Not out of preference, but out of survival instinct. Wood was kinder to frozen hands. You eat near the stove, warming fingers between bites. Food today tastes secondary to heat. Chewing becomes something you do while waiting for sensation to return. The afternoon passes with quieter tasks, mending, sorting, planning. You look at your remaining tools and imagine which ones you would miss most if they failed tomorrow. The thought settles uncomfortably. There is no clear scholarly consensus on whether tool scarcity or fuel scarcity pose the greater long-term risk during severe winters. Letters suggest both fears existed simultaneously, feeding each other. As evening approaches, you clean tools carefully and store them where temperature shifts are least severe. Near inner walls, away from drafts, you wrap metal heads loosely in cloth. It feels excessive. It works. One offhand note in a winter diary mentioned someone tucking a knife under a pillow at night to keep it from freezing. The image lingers with you longer than expected. You bank the fire and settle near it, hands open, letting warmth soak in fully. The cabin creaks softly as temperatures fall again. Tools rest, you rest. Lying down, you think less about what tomorrow will require, and more about what might fail. The difference is subtle but important. Winter teaches you to plan around loss as much as around use. Sleep arrives slowly tonight. Your hands ache faintly, not injured, just reminded. You tuck them close to your body and breathe steadily. Outside, the cold waits without interest. Inside, you have adjusted again. Tools ready, body adapting. Another day shaped quietly by limits rather than force. You notice the change first in your legs. Not pain exactly, but a deeper awareness of weight and effort. When you stand, your knees take a moment to agree. When you walk, your steps feel more deliberate, as if your body now prefers consultation over impulse. Cold reshapes the body quietly. You warm yourself by the stove before attempting anything else. Heat reaches your muscles slowly, like water seeping into packed earth. You rotate your shoulders, roll your wrists, and wait until stiffness loosens just enough to move without protest. This waiting has become instinctive. Ignoring it leads to mistakes. Accounts from long winter settlements suggest that people adapted physically over time, developing thicker layers of fat-altered circulation patterns and a tolerance for discomfort that surprised even themselves. Survival did not depend on strength so much as adjustment. You stretch carefully, aware of every joint. Ankles complain today. You circle them gently, feeling resistance ease bit by bit. Your body has learned the routine just as thoroughly as your mind has. Wake, warm, test, proceed. One small observation tucked into a settler's letter describes how people learn to recognize good pain from bad pain. A dull ache meant adaptation. Sharp pain meant stop immediately. That distinction kept people working when they could and resting when they had to. You step outside briefly, just long enough to feel the cold take hold again. It still shocks, but less than before. Your breath steadies faster, your shoulders hunch automatically. This is not bravery, it is familiarity. Inside, you return to movement. Light tasks first. sweeping frost flakes from the floor, rearranging stored items so you do not have to bend too far later. Every motion is chosen with care now. Efficiency matters less than sustainability. There is disagreement among researchers about whether bodies truly acclimatise to extreme cold or whether people simply learn to endure it mentally. Some physiological evidence suggests genuine adaptation. Other studies emphasise perception over biology. Both seem present here. You sit and rest again sooner than you would have weeks ago. Not because you are weaker, but because you are wiser. Pacing keeps you functional. Overexertion steals tomorrow. You massage your hands near the fire, pressing fingers together until warmth spreads evenly. Skin feels tighter in this climate. Cracks threaten if ignored. You rub in a bit of grease saved for this purpose. It smells faintly animal and smoke. It works. A curious winter habit appears in scattered writings where settlers describe talking to their bodies out loud. Encouragement. Negotiation. Complaints voiced softly into empty rooms. Isolation makes conversation flexible. You stand once more, testing balance. It holds. You move across the cabin without thinking about it now, navigating around objects by memory. The space feels smaller, but your movements fit it better. Food today feels heavier. Not richer, just more noticeable as it settles. Digestion slows in cold. You sit longer after eating, letting warmth assist rather than rushing back into motion. Some historians suggest that winter routines unintentionally created early forms of body awareness practices, though no one would have named them that way. Settlers learned to listen closely because ignoring signals carried immediate consequences. The afternoon passes quietly. You move when needed. You rest when possible. The rhythm feels slower than life you remember, but also steadier. Nothing demands urgency unless you create it. You notice something else today. Your reaction to cold has changed. It still bites, but it no longer startles. Your breath catches less. Your hands recover faster. The body keeps score even when the mind is tired. A small anecdote mentioned in one account describes a man remarking that spring felt stranger than winter because his body no longer trusted warmth. The idea settles in your thoughts briefly, then drifts away. As evening approaches, you feel fatigue differently. It spreads evenly rather than sharply. You are not exhausted. You are spent in a manageable way. This is the goal. You prepare for night with movements that feel almost ritual now. Fire adjusted, bedding arranged, clothing loosened just enough to breathe, not enough to lose heat. There is no consensus among scholars about when winter stopped feeling dangerous and started feeling routine for settlers. Some say never. Others suggest a threshold passed quietly unnoticed until later. You lie down and stretch once more under the blankets, letting muscles lengthen gently. Your breathing slows, your heartbeat steadies. Outside, the cold remains unchanged. Inside, you have changed instead, not dramatically, just enough. You close your eyes knowing your body is learning alongside you. Each day it adapts a little more, each night it recovers a little better. Sleep arrives without struggle, carrying you into another quiet negotiation with winter, one breath at a time. Sickness announces itself softly here. Not with drama, but with small disruptions that feel easy to dismiss at first. A throat that feels tighter than usual. A cough that lingers a second longer. A heaviness behind the eyes that heat alone does not chase away. You notice it one morning when warming your hands takes longer than it should. The fire is steady. The room is no colder than yesterday, and yet your body hesitates. You sit longer, breathing slowly, waiting for warmth to do its work. It does eventually, but not completely. Something has shifted. Living in isolated winter cabins meant illness was treated as both a medical and logistical problem. With doctors far away and travel danger on board, most settlers relied on rest, heat, and folk remedies rather than intervention. Recovery happened at home or not at all. You move barefootly through the morning, conserving energy without fully acknowledging why. Denial costs less than fear. You eat lightly, warm water instead of cold. You listen to your body more closely than usual, cataloguing sensations without judgment. A small but striking note appears in several winter diaries describing people counting days of sickness, not by symptoms but by how long they could still tend the fire. When that stopped, concern became real. You keep the fire close to day. You pull your stool nearer, letting heat reach deeper into your chest. Breathing eases slightly, the cough softens. That's enough to continue. There is uncertainty among historians about how many winter illnesses went unrecorded, simply because people recovered quietly or did not survive to write about it. The absence of records hides as much as it reveals. You prepare a simple broth thinner than usual, letting steam rise slowly. The smell alone brings comfort. You sip carefully, letting warmth travel downward. Food becomes medicine by default when options are limited. One curious remedy mentioned offhand in a letter involves breathing steam from boiled pine needles believed to clear lungs and strengthen the chest. Whether it helped or merely soothed people return to it often. You rest more than usual, lying down during daylight without guilt. Productivity shifts meaning here. Staying alive counts as work. You let the cabin hold you while you do less. Outside, the world remains unchanged. Snow, cold, stillness. That constancy feels grounding. Illness would be more frightening if everything else shifted too. Scholars continue to differ on whether isolation improved recovery by forcing rest or worsened outcomes by delaying care. Accounts support both interpretations depending on severity and circumstance. As afternoon fades, you feel slightly better. Not well, but steadier. You manage the fire with minimal effort, adjusting logs slowly, carefully. You avoid lifting anything heavy, you respect limits today. You rub your chest with a bit of warmed grease, not because you believe deeply in it, but because touch itself feels reassuring. Warmth spreads outward, breathing in. Smooths. Evening comes earlier when you are unwell. Fatigue arrives without warning. You prepare for night while you still have clarity. Fire banked, water nearby, extra blanket added. A passing remark in a winter journal mentions people sleeping upright during illness to ease breathing. You arrange yourself at a slight angle, pillows stacked carefully. There is no panic in this, only caution. You lie still, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin. Fire, wood, wind, they sound the same as always. That steadiness helps more than any remedy. Sleep comes in shorter stretches tonight. You wake, breathe, adjust and drift again. Each waking is gentler than the last. The body works quietly while you rest. By morning, the worst has passed, or perhaps it has simply paused. Either way, you have learned something important. Here, illness is not a separate event. It is folded into winter itself, managed with patience, warmth and attention, rather than cure. Wrapped in blankets and habit, you breathe steadily, letting recovery happen at its own pace, knowing that in this place care is something you give yourself one small decision at a time. You do not see your neighbours often, but you feel them. Their presence shows up in small ways. A thin line of smoke on the horizon when the wind shifts just right. Tracks half filled with the snow that cross the tree line and vanish again. The knowledge that somewhere beyond the white another fire is being fed, another pair of hands is warming slowly just like yours. Settlements in regions this cold were spread wide by necessity. Land needed space, resources demanded distance. Winter turned even short journeys into calculated risks, so people learned to live mostly apart, connected more by awareness than by contact. You step outside after midday not to travel but to check the sky and the wind. It is a habit now. The cold hits familiar and sharp. You scan the horizon instinctively, not looking for beauty but for signs. Smoke, movement, change. There is none today. The world feels paused again. Back inside, you think about the nearest cabin. You know roughly where it sits, even if you have not seen it in weeks. You picture the angle of its roof, the direction its door faces. These imagined details are oddly comforting. One small note tucked into a frontier letter describes settlers tapping trees near their cabins in specific patterns, not as signals, but as reassurance. The sound carried differently in cold air. If someone answered days later, it meant survival continued. You listen now, half expecting something similar. The forest remains quiet. Isolation here is not loneliness in the modern sense. It is a constant state accepted early and rarely questioned. What surprises you is how it sharpens attention. You notice changes more quickly. Sounds matter more. Absence itself becomes information. Some researchers suggest that frontier communities developed a heightened sense of environmental awareness precisely because human contact was so limited. Others argue this awareness was simply a byproduct of necessity, not a cultural trait. The distinction feels academic from where you sit. You prepare something small to eat and set aside a portion without thinking. Habit. If someone did arrive unexpectedly, food would appear. It always did, according to stories. Hospitality was not generosity so much as insurance. A passing anecdote in a winter diary mentions a man who kept an extra chair by the stove all winter even though no one visited. He claimed it reminded him that others existed. The chair stayed. You glance at your own space. There is room near the fire. Always has been. As afternoon fades, you step outside again, this time to dump ash far from the cabin. You move carefully, following a path packed hard by repetition. Wandering even a few steps off can mean sinking deep into drifted snow. You stay within what you know. You pause and listen. Somewhere far off a sound carries. Not clear, not calm, distant knock or crack or echo, you cannot be sure. It could be ice shifting, it could be a tree, or it could be human work axe meeting wood miles away. You do not chase it, you simply note it. That is how connection works here. Historical records suggest that winter neighbours often went weeks without direct contact, yet described feeling part of a community all the same. Awareness replaced proximity. Memory stood in for conversation. Inside again, you tend the fire and sit quietly. Your thoughts drift to how help would arrive if needed. Slowly, carefully, with risk. That knowledge makes you cautious but also deliberate. There is still debate among scholars about whether such isolation strengthened mutual dependence or eroded it. Some communities bonded tightly, others fractured under strain. Outcomes varied widely. You prepare for night as usual, but you leave the lamp lit a little longer than necessary. Light feels companionable tonight. You watch shadows move on the wall and imagine them as motion beyond your own hands. Before sleeping, you step to the window and clear a small patch of frost. You look out into darkness that feels less empty now. Somewhere beyond it, others are doing the same quiet work you are. You lie down with that thought resting lightly in your mind, not lonely, not crowded, simply aware. The fire settles, the cabin creaks, and wrapped in routine and imagined connection, you drift towards sleep, knowing that winter is endured alone but never entirely apart. Work does not announce itself here. It simply continues folding into every hour without asking permission. You notice it most clearly when you stop moving. Stillness makes the list appear. There is always something that needs tending, adjusting, preparing, or quietly fixing before it becomes a problem. You begin the day by checking the things that fail silently. The fire, the water containers, the spots along the wall where yesterday's warmth may have loosened filler, just enough to invite trouble overnight. Prevention matters more than repair in this cold. In many early settler households, winter labour did not decrease so much as change shape. Outdoor work shrank. Indoor labour expanded. Tasks multiplied in smaller, less visible ways, often filling the same number of hours without the satisfaction of obvious progress. You sweep frost grit from the floor and pause to rest the broom against the wall. Even cleaning feels different now. Movements are slower. Dust does not rise. Everything falls straight down, heavy and quiet. One small detail noted in a woman's winter journal describes how she measured the day by how many times she circled the cabin, moving from fire to table to bed to wall and back again. Distance collapsed inward. Effort did not. You warm your hands and return to mending. A sleeve edge worn thin, a seam pulled loose by repeated layering. Needlework becomes a form of maintenance rather than creation. You're not making new things, you are keeping old ones alive. The thread resists stiff with cold. You warm it between your fingers, then pull slowly. Snap happens when patience runs out. You have learned that lesson enough times now. There is uncertainty among historians about how labour was divided during winter beyond broad outlines. Some accounts suggest rigid roles persisted. Others hint that survival blurred lines with whoever could work doing whatever needed doing. Evidence shifts from cabin to cabin. You stand to stretch and feel the weight of clothing tug at your shoulders. Layers protect, but they also tire you. Every movement costs more when wrapped like this. You learn to make fewer movements count for more. Outside wind lifts snow briefly, then lets it fall again. You watch through the window while working using the motion as a clock. When the gusts slow, you know the day is deepening. A brief note from a frontier memoir mentioned someone keeping a list of winter tasks scratched into a board near the door. Not to remember what to do, but to feel the relief of crossing items out. The list grew anyway. You do not keep a list. You carry it in your arms. When shoulders ache, you know you have lifted enough. When eyes blur, you know light has run out. When breath shortens, you just stop. Midday arrives quietly. You eat without ceremony. A few bites, a pause, more later. Hunger has become background noise, something you acknowledge but do not amplify. Some scholars suggest that constant low-level labour during winter helped prevent despair by keeping minds occupied. Others argue it simply delayed emotional fatigue. Reading accounts, it is clear both outcomes occurred. You move furniture slightly, angling a bench away from a draught. The change is small but immediate. Cold no longer finds your calves when you sit. You remember this adjustment for tomorrow. Memory becomes a tool like any other. As afternoon fades, your movements slow further. Not from weakness, but from calibration. You're pacing now without thinking about it. Work expands to fill available warmth, then contracts as cold returns. You bank the fire earlier tonight, anticipating fatigue. Planning ahead feels less like foresight and more like kindness to your future self. One offhand comment in a winter letter describes the relief of finishing all necessary tasks before full dark, even if nothing felt finished. Completion here is about readiness, not finality. You prepare bedding, carefully tucking and layering with practiced motions. Each fold has purpose. Each placement blocks something invisible but real. When you finally sit and do nothing for a moment, it feels earned. The cabin hums softly. Fire responds. Walls hold. There is no sense of accomplishment the way there might be in warmer times. Instead, there is continuity. Today did not break you, that is the measure. You lie down and feel fatigue settle evenly through your body. Muscles relax, thoughts drift without effort. Tomorrow will bring the same work in slightly different order. You accept that without resentment. Routine has become shelter of its own. As sleep comes, you realize that surviving winter is less about endurance than about never letting too many small things fail at once. Tonight nothing has. You breathe slowly, wrapped in layers and habit, and let the long night take you again. You notice the children first in the way the cabin feels quieter than it should be. Not empty, just restrained. Even when there are young ones here, winter teaches them stillness early. Sound costs energy. Movement wastes warmth. Play becomes careful, compact, folded inward like everything else. If children are present, they wake when you wake. Not because they must, but because cold does not respect age. Small bodies lose heat faster. They learn quickly to stay close to fire, and adults to mirror routines without being told. In many frontier households, children took on meaningful responsibilities far earlier than would be expected today. Winter accelerated that process. Fetching kindling, watching the fire, holding tools steady, survival left little room for prolonged childhood. You see it in how they move. Deliberate steps, hands tucked automatically into sleeves, eyes tracking the flame the way others track a clock. They know when to add wood before being asked. They know when to stop talking because the room has gone too quiet. A small detail from the winter diary describes a child learning to count by fire cycles rather than numbers. Morning fire, midday fire, night fire. Time organized itself around warmth. You hand over a simple task and watch closely, not to supervise but to ensure safety. Cold tools, hot iron, sharp edges, Winter does not forgive the stars, or snakes, especially not small ones. There is disagreement among historians about whether early responsibility hardened children prematurely or equipped them with resilience that lasted a lifetime. Some accounts speak of loss, others describe competence and calm beyond years. Both realities existed side by side. You notice how learning happens here without instruction. Children watch, imitate, adjust. Words are used sparingly. Demonstration matters more. Correction comes gently because energy for conflict is limited. Inside the cabin, space is shared carefully. Children learn where not to stand, how to pass behind someone at the stove, how to move quietly around sleeping bodies. Awareness replaces freedom. One curious habit mentioned in a family journal describes children being taught to sleep facing inward toward the fire, rather than outward toward walls, instinctively protecting core warmth even in rest. You prepare food and notice how portions are adjusted subtly. Not favoritism. Calculation. Smaller bodies need steady intake. Warmth matters more than fullness. You hand over food when the fire burns strongest. Outside daylight fades early. Children mark it by shadows on the wall rather than the window. When the shadows soften, evening has arrived. They respond by settling closer together. Some scholars suggest that winter childhood fostered unusually strong memory formation as repetition and high stakes sharpened attention. Others argue long periods of monotony blurred early years together. Memory works differently under strain. You watch them sit near the stove, hands extended, copying your posture exactly. They learn by mirroring. You realize they have been doing this for days without your noticing. As night approaches, routines tighten. Bedding arranged, extra layers added. A child yawns and leans without thinking, trusting that someone will make space at you. Trust grows easily if fed by proximity. One passing remark in the Settler memoir notes that winter nights were when children asked the most questions. Darkness and stillness invited them. Answers were given slowly, thoughtfully, often more to soothe than to instruct. You lie down later listening to their breathing shift into sleep. It comes quickly for them. Growing bodies surrender to rest more readily, even in cold. The cabin seems to breathe differently when they sleep. Softer, slower. There is no clear consensus among historians about whether children adapted better to winter than adults, or simply had fewer expectations to unlearn. Observe them now, it feels like both. Morning will come again, task will return, learning will continue without ceremony. Wrapped in blankets and routine, children dream close to warmth, absorbing winter, not as hardship but as normal. And watching them, you understand that survival here is taught quietly, one shared day at a time. Clothing stops feeling like something you put on. It becomes something you live inside. You notice it when you wake and do not immediately recognize where your body ends and fabric begins. Layers have merged into a single shell that moves when you do, and rests when you rest. You sit up slowly and feel the weight settle around your shoulders and hips. Wool presses gently against skin already warm in the places it touched all night. You adjust a sleeve and realize you've done this same motion every morning without thinking. The body remembers what the mind no longer tracks. In winters, this severe garment served as the first line of shelter long before walls or roofs could help. Multiple historical accounts describe clothing systems that here were layered, repaired, and adapted constantly, more like living structures than outfits. People built warmth on their bodies the way they built cabins on the land. You stand near the fire and loosen nothing yet. Cold still lingers in the room. You rotate slowly, letting heat seep into outer layers before it reaches what is underneath. Removing a coat too soon wastes warmth you work to earn. You check seams and cuffs out of habit. Fraying shows up fastest where movement repeats. Knees, elbows, wrists. You pinch a loose thread and tuck it back in, making a mental note to mend it later. Small failures spread quickly if ignored. Someone once mentioned in a winter letter that clothing felt like armor by January, not stiff but protective in a way that inspired confidence. The comparison feels accurate. You feel exposed without it even indoors. You add another scarf today, looping it loosely rather than tight. Air trapped between layers matters more than pressure. Too snug and circulation suffers. Too loose and drafts creep in. You adjust until it stuff feels right, guided by sensation rather than rule. The question of how much settlers understood about insulation through clothing remains unsettled. Some interpretations suggest practical knowledge passed quietly through generations. Others imply experimentation and error taught people what survived. Either way, systems evolved quickly in places like this. You move through the cabin and notice how clothing changes movement. Bending requires planning. Turning takes space. You adapt routes unconsciously, avoiding sharp corners and narrow passes. The cabin feels smaller because you are larger now. You step outside briefly and feel the cold hit fabric first. It dulls the shock. Your face still burns, but your core stays steady. You pull mittens higher and tuck hands into sleeves, creating pockets of warmth you can return to when needed. A small, easily missed detail appears in a few accounts describing people sewing hidden inner pockets into coats not for storage but for hands. Warmth followed wherever the hands rested. Back inside, you hang outer layers near the stove, rotating them carefully. Too close and they scorch. Too far and they stay stiff. The dance repeats every day. You do it without thinking now. You sit and eat slowly, aware of how fabric cushions every movement. Even sitting feels different when wrapped this way. The body settles deeper, conserving energy by default. Some observers have wondered whether constant layering dulled body awareness over time or sharpened it. Letters suggest people became more sensitive to pressure heat and restriction reading. Comfort like a language. You notice sweat beginning under your arms and open your coat slightly. Moisture is dangerous here. Dampness invites cold faster than any draft. You cool just enough, then close layers again. Balance remains everything. As afternoon passes, you mend. Needle in hand, fabric warmed against your leg. Repairs are small, nearly invisible, but they extend life. Clothing here is never finished. It is maintained. One odd winter habit involved sleeping with tomorrow's clothing folded inside blankets to keep it pliable. You already do this without remembering when it became routine. Evening comes and you layer once more, adding what you removed earlier. The process reverses smoothly. Your hands know the order: shirt, vest, coat, scarf, hat. There is no clear answer among historians about whether clothing innovations mattered more than shelter design in extreme cold survival. From inside your layers, the distinction feels meaningless. Both work together or not at all. You lie down fully dressed and feel the familiar cocoon form around you. Fabric holds warmth close. Blankets add weight. The fire glows low. As sleep approaches, you realize clothing has become architecture. Portable walls, flexible roofs, warmth you carry with you wherever you go. You breathe slowly, wrapped in woolen habit, and let the long night take you again, secure inside the shelter you wear as much as the one you built. You notice the animals before you see them, mostly by sound. A soft shuffle, a breath that does not match your own, a quiet movement near the wall where straw has been piled thicker than usual. The cabin feels fuller tonight, warmer in a way fire alone cannot manage. Animals cross the threshold in winter without ceremony. In places where cold pressed, this hard people often brought livestock indoors during the worst months, not out of affection but necessity. Heat travels both ways. What keeps them alive helps keep you alive too. You step carefully around a low shape near the corner. A goat ribs barely visible under thick winter hair shifts and settles again. Its breath rises in small clouds that drift toward the ceiling and disappear. The smell is sharp, earthy, unmistakable. You barely register it anymore. You learned quickly that animals do not behave indoors the way they do outside. Movement is slower, noise is restrained. They seem to understand the rules of shared warmth instinctively. A curious aside tucked into a frontier journal describes chickens roosting on rafters inside cabins during deep freezes, feathers, puffed bodies, silent, dropping warmth downward like gifts. The image stays with you longer than expected. You lay fresh straw where hooves have packed it flat. Straw insulates, straw absorbs. Straw carries heat surprisingly well when layered thickly. You spread it evenly, careful not to startle anyone. The fire feels different tonight, not stronger but steadier. Body heat fills gaps flame cannot reach. The cold has more trouble finding edges now. There is still disagreement among historians about how common indoor livestock truly was versus how often it was remembered because of its strangeness. Some records describe it as routine, others treat it as an emergency measure. Likely both were true depending on severity. You sit near the stove and listen. The rhythm of breathing has changed, slower, deeper, more varied. The cabin feels less empty even when, no one speak. Animals bring other considerations. Cleanliness becomes relative. You accept a certain level of mess because warmth matters more. You adjust routines rather than fight them. One offhand remark in a winterlietta mentions a cow nudging a door closed with its flank blocking a draft more effectively than any cloth ever could. People notice these things. You keep water near the fire, sharing it carefully. Animals drink slower when warm. You watch them learning patterns. They know where heat pools, just like you do. The question of whether shared shelter increased disease risk remains unresolved among scholars. Some suggest proximity worsened illness. Others note that extreme cold reduced transmission. Evidence points in multiple directions. You eat standing tonight, giving animals space. Food tastes the same, but the room feels different. Fuller, less hollow, you realize how much sound matters. Even quiet sound fills something. As evening deepens, movement settles. Bodies arrange themselves instinctively for maximum warmth. You add wood to the fire and feel heat circulate more evenly now carried by breath and hide. You prepare bedding later than usual, watching for where drafts still creep in. Animals block some of them naturally. Others remain. You adjust blankets accordingly. A strange winter habit mentioned in passing by one settler involved talking to animals at night as if they were neighbours rather than livestock. Loneliness reshapes categories. You lie down carefully aware of weight shifting nearby. The cabin creaks and settles again, accommodating more life within its walls. Sleep arrives differently tonight. The air feels warmer. Sound is softer layered. You breathe in and catch the mixed scent of straw smoke and living warmth. Outside, the cold presses just as hard as ever. Inside, you have blurred the boundary between shelter and survival a little more. Wrapped in blankets and shared heat, you let your eyes close knowing that tonight, winter has fewer places to reach you. You sense the storm before it arrives, not by sight but by pressure. The air inside the cabin feels heavier as if it has decided to sit down and stay a while. The fire draws differently. Smoke hesitates before rising. Even the animals shift their weight unsettled in small quiet ways. You step outside only long enough to confirm what your body already knows. The horizon has vanished. Snow moves sideways now, fast and low, erasing edges as it goes. The wind carries it in sheets that blur ground and sky together. Direction loses meaning quickly in this kind of weather. Distance collapses into white. In regions like this, blizzards were not rare interruptions but expected events sometimes lasting days. Accounts from the early settlements describe storms powerful enough to bury fences, reshape paths and erase familiar landmarks overnight. Orientation depended on memory more than vision. You retreat inside and secure the door with practiced movements. Extra weight against the base. A cloth wedged into the gap. Every small barrier matters now. The storm presses immediately, testing for weakness. Inside, sound changes. Wind does not howl here. It scrapes. It pushes. Snow hisses against the walls like sand. The cabin answers with deep, steady creaks that feel more reassuring than alarming. It has endured this before. One easily overlooked detail in winter writings describes people tying ropes from door to outbuildings or woodpiles before storms, creating lifelines they could follow blindly if needed. Many who failed to do so never made it back when visibility vanished. You are not going anywhere today. That decision settles quickly without debate. Storm days are for waiting and maintaining, not for travel or ambition. You add wood to the fire early, building a reserve of heat while you can. There is still no shared conclusion among historians about whether blizzards caused more fatalities through exposure or through disorientation. Some evidence points to cold itself. Other accounts emphasize how quickly people became lost within steps of shelter. You sit and listen. Wind builds, then eases, then builds again. The rhythm is irregular, tiring in its unpredictability. You feel it in your shoulders the way tension rises without action. Animals shift closer to the fire. You adjust straw and give them space. Shared warmth tightens the room further, but no one complains. Comfort is relative now. Light fades completely by midday. Snow blocks what little daylight winter offers. The cabin becomes a closed system. Fire, breath, waiting. You eat little, conserving energy. Hunger dulls in storms anyway. Thirst matters more. You sip warmed water, slowly, careful not to waste heat. Some observers have suggested that storm days intensified mental strain more than physical hardship. Trapped indoors with no sense of time passing, people relied heavily on routine to prevent spiraling thoughts. Others found the forced stillness calming. Reactions varied widely. You occupy your hands with small tasks, mending, sorting, checking seals along walls, anything to keep motion gentle and purposeful. Too much activity creates sweat. Sweat invites cold later. Outside, the storm rages without concern. Inside, the fire hums steadily. The contrast feels almost surreal. A brief note from a settler's journal mentions counting storms rather than weeks during winter, each one marking survival more clearly than calendar dates. You understand that now. Enduring this matters more than knowing the day. As evening arrives without ceremony, the wind finally begins to ease. Not stop, just soften. Snow still falls, but more vertically now. The cabin exhales with you. You bank the fire carefully, preparing for a colder night that often follows storms. Clear skies bring sharper cold. You plan ahead instinctively. When you lie down, the world outside feels very far away, sealed behind walls and snow. Inside, everything feels close. Breath, heat, sound. You close your eyes, listening to the last whispers of wind, grateful not for victory but for shelter that held and decisions that kept you still. The storm passes eventually. Winter always moves on, but tonight, wrapped in shared warmth and patient waiting, you rest, knowing that staying put was the bravest work of the day. When the storm leaves, it does not take the darkness with it. Instead, it leaves behind a heavier quiet, the kind that presses inward rather than echoing away. You wake to that quiet, and know immediately that the world outside has been rearranged. The cabin feels sealed tighter than usual, as if snow has leaned itself carefully against every weak point and decided to stay. The fire has held through the night, but only just. You feed it and listen to the room respond, sound returning slowly, reluctantly. This is when the mind becomes the main work. Your body understands winter now. It knows how to brace, how to ration, how to move without argument. The mind, however, circles. Thoughts repeat themselves if left alone. You notice it when you sit still too long. The same questions looping quietly. How much wood remains? How long until spring? How many storms like this are left? You interrupt the loop deliberately. You stand and stretch even though nothing requires it. Movement breaks the pattern. You give your hands a task, sorting, folding, adjusting. Purpose keeps the mind from wandering into places that offer no solutions. People who endured winters like this often wrote less about cold than about sameness. The days blurred together, each shaped by identical constraints. Without effort, time lost texture. Keeping track of small changes became essential. You mark the morning by clearing snow from the door. The drift resists at first, packed hard by wind. You dig slowly, careful not to sweat. Each shovel full makes a difference. The light outside is blinding now, reflecting off endless white. You squint and work by feel. One odd coping habit mentioned quietly in a few personal writings involved talking through tasks out loud, narrating simple action to give the day structure. You find yourself doing it without realizing naming what comes next. Back inside, you warm up gradually and pause to rest. Rest is not laziness here, it is strategy. Overdoing it steals tomorrow's strength. The fire settles into a steady rhythm again. You sit near it and let your thoughts drift, but not too far. You have learned the edge. Past it lies worry that cannot be solved today. There is no single explanation offered by historians for how settlers managed long periods of mental strain in isolation. Some records suggest strict routine provided stability. Others imply moments of collapse followed by recovery. The human response seems as varied as the people themselves. You focus on small comforts, the feel of warmth on your palms, the smell of smoke, the weight of fabric on your shoulders. Sensation anchors you to the present moment. You prepare food slowly, not from hunger but from habit. Eating marks time. It divides the day into sections that feel manageable. Warmth rises with steam fogging the air briefly before clearing again. A passing note in one winter account describes someone carving small marks into a beam for each storm survived, not to count days but to prove movement forward. The marks meant nothing to anyone else. They mattered deeply to the person who made them. You do not carve anything. You count fire cycles instead. Morning, midday, evening, night. Each one completed without failure is enough. As afternoon fades, you feel the familiar tug of restlessness. Storm days compress energy. You release it with gentle motion, stretching, walking slow circles around the cabin, touching walls, reassuring yourself that everything remains where it should be. Some scholars have suggested that winter isolation sharpened introspection, while others argue it dulled thought into repetition. Sitting here, it feels like both happen in turns, depending on how closely you listen to yourself. You prepare for evening earlier than usual. Darkness arrives without warning when skies stay clear after storms. You bank the fire carefully and arrange bedding with extra attention. The night will be colder. You plan accordingly. When you lie down, your thoughts still try to wander. You redirect them gently, focusing on breath. In, out, slow and even. You imagine warmth settling deeper with each exhale. Outside, the world is silent and reshaped. Inside, you remain unchanged enough to continue. Sleep comes not because everything is easy, but because you have learned how to guide your mind away from what cannot be fixed until morning. Wrapped in routine and patience, you drift again, knowing that endurance is as much mental as it is physical. Comfort arrives here in pieces so small you might miss them, if you are not paying attention. It is not warmth exactly, nor ease, nor relief. It is the absence of certain discomforts for a few moments at a time, and those moments matter more than they should. You wake feeling rested enough, not refreshed, just capable. That distinction becomes important. Capability means you can continue. Anything more would feel extravagant. The fire responds quickly this morning, as if remembering you. You warm your hands and notice how familiar the posture has become. Palms open, fingers slightly curled, elbows tucked in. Your body finds the position before your mind does. Small comforts begin with predictability. In cabins like this, daily routines quietly replace luxuries. A warm spot on the floor, a stool positioned just right, a cup that fits your hands well. These details show up repeatedly in winter accounts, not because they were remarkable, but because they were reliable. You move the stool closer to the stove by a few inches. The difference is immediate. Heat reaches your calves now. You exhale without realizing you are holding breath. One easily overlooked winter habit involved people arranging their space repeatedly throughout the day, nudging objects closer to heat or farther away as conditions shifted. Comfort was mobile, not fixed. You prepare something warm to eat more for the feeling than the calories. Steam curls upward and brushes your face. The scent is mild but familiar. That familiarity does more than the food itself. It tells you this moment has happened before and ended well. You sit and eat, slowly savouring not flavour, but temperature. Heat spreads outward from your core. Muscles relax incrementally. Your shoulders drop without instruction. There is uncertainty among historians about whether settlers experienced moments of genuine comfort during deep winter or simply brief relief from discomfort. Reading accounts closely, the language suggests relief mattered just as much. Comfort did not need to be complete to be meaningful. You clean up and pause before starting the next task. This pause is new. Earlier in winter, you filled every moment with motion. Now you allow space. The fire burns steadily. Nothing is urgent. That realization settles gently. You adjust your bedding even though it is not time to sleep. Smoothing a fold, tucking an edge. These actions feel soothing, almost meditative. Order creates a sense of control when so much else resists it. A small anecdote from a winter letter mentions someone keeping a favourite stone near the stove, warming it and holding it in their hands during quiet moments. The stone had no purpose beyond comfort. That was enough. You glance around your cabin and recognise similar objects. A cup you prefer, a blanket with softer patches, a spot by the wall where drafts never reach. You gravitate towards these without thinking. The afternoon passes quietly. You work but gently. Tasks that once felt demanding now feel manageable, not because they are easier, but because you have learned their rhythm. Knowledge smooths effort. Some observers have suggested that repeated exposure to hardship sharpened appreciation for minor pleasures. Others argue people simply lowered expectations. Sitting here, the difference feels academic. Appreciation and adaptation blend together. You take advantage of the warmest part of the day to sit near the window and let light reach your face. It is pale and indirect, but it counts. Your eyes close briefly. Light through closed lids feels almost warm. A curious winter practice noted in passing involved people positioning mirrors or polished objects to catch sunlight for a few extra minutes of brightness. The effect was subtle but cherished. As evening approaches, you prepare something small to look forward to. A warmed drink, a piece of food saved specifically for night. Anticipation becomes its own comfort. The future does not feel endless when it contains small markers. You arrange your space carefully before darkness settles. Lamp, fire, bedding, everything placed where it will be easiest to reach later. Ease of movement matters more as fatigue grows. There remains debate about whether these small comforts improved long-term resilience or simply made winters bearable in the moment. The records do not agree. From inside the experience, the question feels unnecessary. Bearable is enough. You sit near the fire as night deepens, hands resting loosely in your lap. Heat radiates steadily. The room feels settled. Even the animals shift less, breathing slow and even. You notice your thoughts wandering less tonight. They drift but do not spiral. The presence of comfort anchors them. You stay in the room instead of travelling elsewhere in your mind. When you finally lie down, you pull blankets up, slowly savouring the moment they trap warmth. Fabric settles. Weight distributes evenly. Your body sighs in a way it has not for weeks. Outside, the cold remains absolute. Inside, you have assembled a small collection of things that help. None of them impressive, all of them effective. You close your eyes and focus on these small successes. A warm drink, a draft blocked, a seat adjusted just right. These are not victories, but they are enough. Sleep arrives quietly, carried by the steady realization that comfort does not have to be grand to be real. It only has to be present long enough to let you rest. Belief becomes quieter in winter. Not louder, not more dramatic. It settles into the background like a low hum you only notice when it stops. You feel it now in the way you pause before certain tasks, or in how you touch the doorframe briefly before stepping outside, even when there is no clear reason to do so. You do not think of this as faith exactly. It feels more like habit shaped by hope. In places where winters pressed, this hard people leaned on a mixture of religious belief, superstition, and personal ritual without drawing sharp lines between them. Formal prayer existed alongside practical charms, gestures, and sayings that offered comfort, even when logic had little to add. You stir the fire and murmur something under your breath. Not a prayer you were taught, just words that feel right in the moment. They mark intention more than expectation. One easily missed detail in a winter account describes someone refusing to whistle indoors during storms, believing it invited wind inside. The logic was unclear, the comfort was real. The habit stayed. You notice how certain actions feel weighted now. Knocking twice before opening the door. Always stepping into boots right foot first, banking the fire in the same order every night. These patterns anchor you when uncertainty grows. There is no clear agreement among historians about whether such rituals reduced anxiety or merely gave it shape. Some interpretations frame them as coping mechanisms. Others view them as cultural inheritance adapting to extreme conditions. From inside the habit, the distinction feels unnecessary. You go about your tasks with these small gestures woven in. They do not slow you down, they smooth transitions. They make moments feel complete. Outside, the day remains cold and bright. Snow reflects light sharply. You squint and pull your scarf higher. Before stepping back inside, you glance at the sky briefly as if checking in. You could not explain what you are looking for. Inside, you warm your hands and sit quietly for a while. Stillness invites thought, and thought invites memory. You recall sayings passed down half-remembered, warnings about weather, promises about endurance. They surface unprompted. A passing note in a settler's journal mentions someone keeping a small object near the stove all winter, not for use, but because it had survived the journey west intact. Its presence felt protective. You look around and realize you have something similar, though you never named it that way. As afternoon fades, light shifts again. You notice the subtle change immediately now. Winter has trained your attention to small signals. You respond by preparing for evening earlier than you once would have. Some scholars suggest that belief systems provided structure when external order collapsed under harsh conditions. Others argue that practicality always outweighed belief. Reading between the lines, it seems both operated together, neither fully separate. You add wood to the fire and watch the flames settle. You wait a moment longer than necessary just to be sure. Certainty is valuable here. You arrange bedding and smooth it with deliberate motions. Each action feels like closing a loop, beginning, middle, end. The day holds together when loops close properly. As night arrives, you sit near the fire and let your thoughts drift without guiding them. They wander through memories and possibilities, then return on their own. You do not chase them. A curious winter habit mentioned quietly in one account involved people telling the fire good night before sleeping. The words did not change anything, the act did. You smile faintly at the idea, then realize that you have been doing something similar without noticing. You check the fire one last time, nod and turn away. When you lie down, the cabin feels settled. Not safe in an absolute sense, but held together by intention and repetition. Belief has done its quiet work. You breathe slowly, letting the weight of the day ease off you. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, you have created meaning small enough to carry. Sleep comes gently wrapped, not in certainty, but in the reassurance that some things remain steady simply because you keep returning to them. You notice the change, not by warmth, but by sound. Snow no longer squeaks the same way underfoot when you step outside. It gives a softer answer, now less brittle, as if the ground itself has relaxed a fraction. The cold still grips, but its hold feels different, less absolute. This is how winter loosens, quietly, without announcement. Inside the cabin, nothing looks changed. Frost still traces the window. The fire still demands attention. Your breath still fogs the air when you forget to bank heat properly. And yet something underneath all of it has shifted. People who lived through long northern winters often wrote that spring did not arrive as a moment, but as a suspicion, a sense that the season had begun to argue with itself. Days warmed slightly, then snapped back cold. Snow melted, then returned. The body noticed before the calendar ever did. You step out for a few minutes longer than usual today. The air stings, but it does not bite as deeply. Your breath steadies faster. You lift your face toward the pale sun and feel something close to warmth on your cheeks. It surprises you enough that you stand there longer than planned. One small detail tucked into a settler's letter describes someone standing outside without mittens for the first time in months just to feel the air directly again. The act was brief, the feeling stayed. Back inside you move differently, not faster, just with less resistance. Your joints still complain, but they release sooner. Your shoulders drop more easily when you sit near the fire. The work feels marginally lighter, though nothing about it has actually changed. There is no single explanation offered for how people recognize winter's retreat. Some accounts emphasize temperature, others point to light sound or animal behavior. The evidence does not settle on one signal. It seems everyone noticed it in their own way. You find yourself thinking ahead without forcing it. Wood supply, water paths, places where snowdrifts might collapse soon. Planning no longer feels like anxiety, it feels like permission. You open the door a crack to let in fresh air and do not rush to close it. Cold enters, but it does not overwhelm the room instantly. The fire holds its ground. That alone would have been unthinkable weeks ago. A curious observation mentioned in passing by one settler involved the smell of thaw, long before any visible melting occurred. Damp earth, wood releasing resin. You catch something similar now, faint and almost imagined. As the day unfolds, light lingers a little longer on the walls. Shadows soften instead of sharpening. The cabin feels less compressed by darkness. You notice yourself delaying the lamp, letting daylight stretch until it fades naturally. Some scholars suggest that this transitional period was the most mentally taxing as hope returned unevenly and expectation rose too soon. Others argue it provided relief simply by breaking monotony. Reading the accounts, both reactions appear side by side. You work steadily, but with less urgency. The fire still matters. The cold still matters. But the pressure has eased just enough for you to notice it. Your movements feel less like defense and more like maintenance. You eat and realize you are hungrier than usual. Appetite returns, cautiously testing the idea that effort might soon be rewarded with fuel that does not immediately disappear into warmth. Outside, the snow shifts under the sunlight, settling and cracking softly. You hear water somewhere beneath it, not flowing, just thinking about it. The sound stops when a cloud passes. You wait for it to return. When evening comes, it does not feel as heavy. Darkness arrives, but it feels temporary now, like something that will give way again soon. You bank the fire, but not as tightly. You allow yourself that small risk.